Hello, I'm Paul Zimmy Finn, and this is the Generation Report. From where I stood, facing the runway at Mitchell Field, Long Island, New York, I could see a tiny dot up in the sky. It was a Douglas C-54, winging in from Europe with a priceless cargo aboard, wounded American veterans returning home. The giant four-motored Skymaster came closer, light from the sun touching her silver wings. With a graceful dip, she headed into the wind and settled down in the landing strip. As the wheels touched, a base officer asked me, "Did you see that white puff of smoke?" I nodded. "Burning rubber," he explained. "Friction of the wheels against the runway causes it. When one of these big planes lands, enough rubber may be burned off the tires to keep an automobile running for months. Just one more reason why the Army needs so much rubber, and why people have to do without tires." That passage is an excerpt from the National Geographic magazine issue dated September 1945. The story and the issue itself were the last the magazine submitted for publishing before VJ Day. In the margin space atop the issue cover, it reads, "Buy U.S. War Savings Bonds and Stamps." Just how long is 75 years in both historical and human terms? One reflection this month comes courtesy of none other than National Geographic. On the cover of the magazine's June 2020 issue is the face of a man well over 100 years old. Large letters on the lower right cover give him context: the last voices of World War II. The man's name is Lawrence Brooks. At 110, he is America's oldest living World War II veteran. Serving in the Army's 91st Engineers Battalion, Brooks, an African American, contributed to the building of roads, rails, and landing strips at locations throughout the Pacific. A native of Louisiana Bayou country, Brooks seldom left the 91st Engineers feeling hungry when he was called upon to do a little cooking. A widower and family man with 5 children, 13 grandchildren, and 22 great-grandchildren, Mr. Brooks is feted on his birthday each year at the National World War II Museum in New Orleans, where he lives. Another serviceman profiled in National Geographic is a man named Harry T. Stewart, Jr. A native of Queens, New York, and an African American like Brooks, Mr. Stewart, age 95, was a lieutenant colonel in the Army's famed Tuskegee Airmen Squadron in Europe. For his piloting and his aerial feats, Lieutenant Colonel Stewart was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. Like Brooks, Lieutenant Colonel Stewart endured the indignities of discrimination both in and out of the service, but on his own accord sufficiently overcame prejudice to have a long and distinguished career as an engineer with several companies. Lieutenant Colonel Stewart retired, having ascended to the rank of Vice President. The stories of veterans like Lawrence Brooks and Harry T. Stewart Jr. resonate because once they pass on, first-hand accounts of the service they gave to America and to humanity will reside entirely in history books. National Geographic acknowledges as much. Quote, "With the passage of time, public awareness of the war has faded, becoming as dim as the sepia tones of an old photograph." Unquote. An inseparable part of this fading is simply time itself. Those who served during World War II overwhelmingly belong to the GI generation, the youngest cohorts of whom are in their mid-90s today, and every generation is mortal. But beyond these last veterans' stories about the hell of war or personal triumphs over racism or their thoughts about their legacies, another question looms. What lasting lessons can we take from this generation about the importance of civic virtue, not only in a crisis, but as an approach to live by over a lifetime? National Geographic asks no questions and offers no thoughts on this in 2020, and that's disappointing. Going beyond the magazine, there are 3 other World War II veterans' stories I want to share with you. In a Toastmasters class about 10 years ago, I met Pat Emiro, a Marine veteran from Massachusetts who received a Purple Heart after being wounded in combat in the Solomon Islands. After a lifetime spent working in education, Emiro had enrolled in Toastmasters to unburden himself of his war experiences, which he had never spoken of until then. He was quite the public speaker. Emiro passed away in 2013 at age 89. In a chance meeting in Washington, D.C. 5 years ago, I met Louis Caruso, an Army veteran who as a paratrooper saw combat at the Battle of the Bulge. After the war, Caruso joined the family business, a bakery on North Capitol Street in D.C. that baked bread for many fine restaurants across the district. That establishment, Catania Bakery, happens to be around the corner from where I used to live. Although Caruso's family had long since sold the bakery by the time I lived in the neighborhood, 2 things had stayed exactly the same: the recipe and the war decorations behind a glass case along the wall. Louis, a sweet and smiling man, passed away in 2016 at age 102. Catania's still makes the best bread in D.C. The final veteran story I want to relay is of someone I did not have the opportunity to meet. He served in the Navy aboard a fleet tug in the Pacific. As a salvage diver, he retrieved both planes and boats and earned the rank of lieutenant junior grade. After the war, he resumed his college education, which he had interrupted for the service, to complete his degree. While there, he met the woman who became his wife, and he eventually settled into a job as a salesman for a steel fence company. Although he and his wife would make a happy home and have 2 children, he sadly would not know them for long. For in his time salvage diving during the war, chemical exposures which could latently make one sick were a fact of life. Just over 10 years out of the service, the former lieutenant junior grade received a cancer diagnosis. He passed away in 1957 at age 34. That lieutenant junior grade's name was Paul Finnegan, and he was my grandfather. From the stories which have been passed down to me, I hear that my grandfather was a beloved practical joker who had an affinity for water balloons. About a year before he passed away, my grandfather purchased a book that had just been published. That book was Profiles in Courage by then Senator John F. Kennedy. My grandfather signed it. Today, it is one of my most cherished heirlooms. My grandmother, who passed away in 2009, helped me start a National Geographic collection when I was a kid. Today, as you might guess, I keep a few of those on my bookshelf too. The fourth turning asserts that hero generations are quote-unquote made, not born, and I agree. Different hero generations, however, can leave very different historical legacies behind. 3/4 of a century after the GIs made their most meaningful contribution to America and to posterity, how are we honoring their legacy? On January 11, 1989, President Reagan delivered his farewell address from the Oval Office. In that farewell, Reagan offered a warning for the future, one which carries special meaning for us today. The new patriotism won't count for much, and it won't last, unless it's grounded in thoughtfulness and knowledge. An informed patriotism is what we want. And are we doing a good enough job teaching our children what America is and what she represents in the long history of the world? Our spirit is back, but we haven't reinstitutionalized it. We've got to teach history based not on what's in fashion, but what's important. On the 40th anniversary of D-Day, I read a letter from a young woman writing to her late father who had fought on Omaha Beach. She said, "We will always remember, we will never forget what the boys of Normandy did." Well, let's help her keep her word. If we forget what we did, we won't know who we are. I'm warning of an eradication of the American memory that could result, ultimately, in an erosion of the American spirit. Please tune in to the next episode, Millennials and the Road Here. Thank you for listening, stay safe, and may God bless America.